Does your life feel like a race where the finish line never arrives? You solve dozens of problems, go to sleep exhausted, and still wake up feeling like you haven't moved forward at all. Why is it that, in both physics and spirituality, the people who seem to exert the least effort are the ones who hold the most power and shape reality in their favor? Something doesn't add up, and you can feel it. You're moving all the time, but not arriving. Doing more, but feeling less clarity. This is the illusion. Constant action that looks like progress, but quietly drains your energy without changing your direction. For a moment, pause and notice your body. Is there tension? A sense of pressure to keep going? That's not power, that's leakage. Real movement doesn't exhaust you like this, it aligns you. And what if the problem isn't that you're not doing enough, but that you've never been shown when to stop? Do you know that terrible feeling of finishing the week as if you fought the entire world, yet didn't take a single real step toward what you truly want? In classical physics, this is called friction, your vital energy being dissipated into nothingness, creating emotional wear without producing any real work or progress. You wake up early, you respond to messages, you solve urgent problems, you check things off your list. From the outside, it looks like movement. From the inside, it feels like effort. But when you pause for a moment and ask yourself what actually changed, there's a strange silence. Nothing essential moved, nothing meaningful advanced. This is where the illusion begins to reveal itself. Not all movement is progress, and not all effort creates results. Friction happens when energy is spent resisting, correcting, reacting, and maintaining things that don't truly matter. It's like trying to run against a strong wind. Your legs burn, your lungs work harder, your body proves that effort is real, but your position barely changes. The system absorbs everything you give and returns almost nothing. In your daily life, this friction shows up in subtle ways, constantly switching tasks, saying yes when you should pause, trying to control outcomes that are still undefined, replaying conversations in your mind, forcing decisions before clarity arrives. It all feels productive because it keeps you busy, but it quietly drains your capacity to do anything that actually shifts your direction. And the most dangerous part is that friction disguises itself as responsibility. You tell yourself you're doing what needs to be done. You convince yourself that slowing down would mean falling behind. So you keep going, adding more effort on top of misaligned effort, hoping that intensity will eventually turn into progress. But physics doesn't work like that, and neither does your inner system. When energy is misaligned, adding more of it only increases resistance. Think about how often you've pushed harder on something that wasn't working, believing that persistence alone would break through. Sometimes persistence is necessary, but often what you're facing isn't a wall, it's a signal. A signal that your direction, timing, or state is off. The illusion tells you just keep going. Reality whispers, something here needs to change. You can feel the difference if you're honest for a moment. There's a kind of effort that feels clean, focused, almost quiet, even when it's intense. And there's another kind that feels scattered, heavy, and endless. One moves you forward, the other keeps you spinning in place. Most people never question this, because they've been conditioned to measure their worth by how much they do, not by how much actually matters. So they fill their days with motion and call it purpose. But your system keeps the score in a different way. It registers tension, it accumulates fatigue. It notices when actions don't align with intention, and over time it starts to resist you back. That resistance shows up as procrastination, confusion, lack of clarity, or even that quiet sense of emptiness at the end of a long day. Not because you didn't do enough, but because what you didn't truly connect. Friction is not just physical. It's emotional, mental, and even perceptual. It distorts how you see your own progress. It makes you believe that stopping is dangerous, when in reality continuing blindly is what keeps you stuck. And here's where things become uncomfortable. If you remove all the unnecessary movement, all the reactive tasks, all the noise, what remains might feel almost too simple, maybe even empty at first. Because without friction, you're no longer distracted by constant activity. You're left facing direction, and direction requires clarity. This is why many people unconsciously choose friction. It gives them something to do. It fills the space where uncertainty would otherwise appear. It protects them from having to ask deeper questions like, is this actually what I want? Or why am I really doing this? So they stay in motion, not because it works, but because stopping feels unfamiliar. But if you pay close attention, you'll notice something else happening beneath all this activity. A subtle drain, a kind of internal short circuit that gets triggered every time you try to force things into place instead of aligning with them. At first, it just feels like tiredness. Then it becomes frustration, and if it continues, it starts interfering with your ability to think clearly, decide calmly, and act with precision. What you're experiencing is not a lack of effort, it's the cost of misdirected energy, and unless you learn to recognize this pattern, you'll keep feeding it, believing that the solution is always more, when in reality the shift begins somewhere completely different, somewhere most people avoid looking. There is a silent and highly destructive mistake you make every time you try to force things to happen. It's an invisible habit that literally blocks what you're trying to attract. Later, I'll show you how to deactivate this state of self-sabotage in seconds. But first, you need to understand what is draining your energy right now. It doesn't look like a mistake. In fact, it feels like determination. It feels like you're taking control, pushing forward, refusing to give up. But underneath that surface, something else is happening, something subtle and costly. Every time you try to force an outcome, your system enters a state of internal conflict. Part of you is trying to make something happen. Another part of you doesn't fully believe it will. That tension creates interference, like two opposing electrical currents colliding in the same circuit. The result is not more power, it's instability. This is the short circuit. You may recognize it in moments when you keep checking your phone for a response that hasn't arrived, or when you repeat the same action again and again, hoping for a different result, or when your mind starts racing, trying to calculate every possible scenario to make sure things go your way. On the outside, it looks like effort. On the inside, it feels like pressure. And pressure, when sustained, distorts your perception. Instead of seeing clearly, you begin to interpret everything through urgency. Small delays feel like rejection. Neutral situations feel like obstacles. Silence feels like something is wrong. The illusion grows stronger here, convincing you that if you just push a little harder, move a little faster, insist a little more, you'll finally break through. But what's really happening is the opposite. The more you force, the more your system tightens, and the more it tightens, the less responsive you become to real opportunities. Your awareness narrows, your sensitivity drops. You stop noticing subtle signals that would normally guide you. It's like trying to tune a radio while shaking it at the same time. The signal is there, but your own interference prevents you from receiving it. This is why forcing things often leads to outcomes that feel off, even when they technically work. You might achieve what you wanted, but it comes with tension, complications, or a strange sense that something isn't aligned. Because the state you used to get there shaped the result. Your internal state is not separate from what you create, it is part of the creation. And when that state is driven by urgency, fear, or lack, it sends mixed signals. One part says, I want this. Another part says, I don't trust this will happen. That contradiction doesn't accelerate reality, it confuses it. The illusion here is deeply convincing. It tells you that intensity equals effectiveness, that if you care enough, push enough, and stay mentally engaged at all times, you're increasing your chances. But real alignment doesn't feel like pressure. It feels like coherence. There's a quiet certainty in it, a steadiness that doesn't need to rush. When you act from that place, your movements become precise, not frantic. You don't need to chase outcomes because your actions are already in sync with them. The short circuit only happens when you override that natural rhythm. And most of the time, you don't even notice you're doing it. It becomes a habit, a reflex. The moment something matters to you, you grip it tighter. You monitor it more. You try to control every variable. Without realizing it, you're interrupting the very process that would allow it to unfold. Take a moment and think about something in your life that flowed easily. A conversation that felt natural. A decision that became obvious without overthinking. An opportunity that appeared without struggle. In those moments, you weren't forcing anything. You were present, responsive, and open. Your system wasn't overloaded with conflicting signals. There was no short circuit, only clarity. Now compare that to the areas where you feel stuck. The difference is not your capability, it's your state. And this is where the real warning lies. If you continue operating in this pattern, the cost doesn't stay small. That internal interference begins to accumulate. What starts as mental pressure turns into emotional exhaustion. What feels like urgency slowly becomes anxiety. And over time, your entire system starts operating under strain. You don't just lose energy, you lose accuracy. Your decisions become reactive instead of intentional. Your actions become repetitive instead of effective. And the gap between effort and result keeps growing, reinforcing the illusion that you need to do even more. But more of the same state only deepens the problem. At a certain point, it's no longer about productivity or efficiency, it becomes a question of stability. Because when your internal system is constantly overloaded, it doesn't just slow you down, it begins to break down. And if that pattern isn't interrupted, what comes next is not just frustration, it's something far more difficult to recover from. If you don't interrupt this cycle, exhaustion will be the least of your problems. In thermodynamics, uncontrolled agitation creates entropy, pure disorder within a system. When you vibrate in constant urgency, pressure escalates, your physical health declines, clarity disappears, and your electromagnetic field begins to aggressively repel good opportunities. Your system enters total breakdown. At first, it doesn't look like collapse, it looks like a busy life. Your schedule fills up. Your mind stays active even when your body is tired. You start normalizing a constant background tension as if it's just part of being responsible, part of being someone who gets things done. The illusion keeps whispering that this pace is necessary, that slowing down would mean losing control. But what's actually happening is much less glamorous. Your system is overheating. In physics, when a system is pushed beyond its capacity without regulation, it doesn't become more productive, it becomes unstable. Energy stops being directed and starts being scattered. The same thing happens inside you. Your attention fragments, your emotions become less predictable. Your reactions intensify, even in situations that don't require that level of response. You begin to notice small signs. You forget simple things. You reread the same sentence multiple times. You feel irritated without a clear reason. Decisions that used to be easy now feel heavy. These are not random moments. They are indicators that your internal order is breaking down. And still, most people respond the same way. They push harder. Because the illusion tells them that the solution to disorder is more effort. But effort applied to a disorganized system doesn't restore balance. It accelerates the collapse. Imagine trying to organize a room by throwing everything into different corners at high speed. You're moving, you're active, but nothing is actually being resolved. Over time, the chaos increases, and your ability to even see what needs to be done becomes compromised. That's what constant urgency does to your inner world. It creates noise, and when noise dominates your system, something critical disappears. Signal. The signal is your ability to sense what matters, to recognize timing, to choose the right action at the right moment. Without it, you don't stop acting. You just start acting blindly. You respond instead of deciding. You react instead of creating. This is where many people unknowingly cross a line. They are no longer in control of their actions. They are being driven by accumulated pressure. Their choices are shaped by tension, not clarity. And because they're still moving, still doing, still trying, they don't immediately realize that they've lost alignment. The illusion becomes stronger here because activity is still present. From the outside, everything looks functional. But internally, the system is fragmenting. And fragmentation has a cost. Your body begins to carry what your mind refuses to process. Sleep becomes shallow or inconsistent. Your energy fluctuates unpredictably. Even moments of rest don't fully restore you, because the internal agitation never actually stops. At the same time, your perception of reality shifts. Opportunities start to feel distant or unreachable. Problems seem bigger than they are. You may even begin to interpret neutral events as negative, because your system is already overloaded and searching for confirmation of that state. This is not bad luck. It's not coincidence. It's what happens when disorder becomes your baseline. In thermodynamics, once entropy reaches a certain level, the system doesn't self-correct easily. It requires an intentional shift, something that interrupts the pattern and allows energy to reorganize. Without that interruption, the cycle feeds itself. You feel pressure, so you act faster. Acting faster creates more noise. More noise reduces clarity. Reduced clarity leads to poorer decisions. Poor decisions create more pressure, and the loop continues. What makes this even more difficult to detect is that society often rewards the early stages of this pattern. Being constantly busy is seen as commitment. Being always available is seen as reliability. Pushing through fatigue is seen as strength. But none of these are sustainable indicators of true effectiveness. They are signs of a system approaching its limits. And when those limits are reached, the breakdown doesn't ask for permission. It shows up as burnout, as emotional shutdown, as loss of direction. It forces stillness, but in a way that feels like failure instead of choice. And this is the turning point most people never see coming, because the same energy they believed was moving them forward was actually accelerating them toward collapse. The question is not whether you have enough energy to keep going. The real question is whether your energy is organized or scattered, whether it's building something or dissolving under pressure. And somewhere beneath all that movement, there is a different kind of power waiting, a form of energy that doesn't depend on speed, urgency, or force, but on something far more stable and far more precise. To avoid this collapse, observe the mechanics of a bow and arrow. The true power of impact doesn't come from shaking the bow frantically. The devastating force is born from silent tension, that moment of absolute stillness where all potential energy is stored before release. Learning to pause is how you recharge your invisible battery. This idea can feel almost uncomfortable at first, especially if you've been conditioned to believe that movement equals progress. The illusion tells you that if you're not constantly doing something, you're falling behind. But the bow doesn't work that way. If the archer keeps moving, adjusting, fidgeting without ever holding still, the arrow never gains direction, never gains force. Stillness is not the absence of action. It is the preparation for meaningful action. When you pause intentionally, something subtle begins to reorganize inside you. Your breathing slows, your thoughts begin to settle. The noise that was once overwhelming starts to separate into distinct signals. What felt urgent a moment ago may reveal itself as unnecessary. What felt confusing begins to show a simple next step. This is potential energy building. In physics, potential energy is stored energy. It doesn't look impressive from the outside because nothing is visibly happening, but internally, everything is aligning. The system is gathering strength, direction, and coherence. When release finally happens, it is precise and efficient. Your mind and body operate under the same principle. When you allow yourself to stop, not out of avoidance but out of awareness, you begin to collect your scattered energy. All the fragments of attention that were spread across distractions, worries, and forced efforts start returning to a center point. And that center point is where clarity lives. Most people never experience this because they interrupt the process too early. The moment things become quiet, they reach for stimulation. They check something, think of something else, move into another task. They break the tension before it has time to transform into power. The illusion pushes them to escape that stillness, because stillness feels unfamiliar. It removes the constant feedback of activity. It forces you to face what is actually happening inside without distraction. But if you stay there just a little longer, something shifts. You begin to notice that not all thoughts deserve your attention. You see patterns in your reactions. You recognize impulses that were previously automatic. And in that recognition, you gain a form of control that doesn't require force. This is where your energy stops leaking. Instead of reacting immediately, you start choosing your response. Instead of chasing every possibility, you begin to sense which ones are aligned. Your actions become fewer, but far more effective. Like the arrow, you don't need constant motion. You need the right release. There's also a physical dimension to this that often goes unnoticed. Your body stores tension when you're in constant urgency. Your shoulders tighten, your jaw clenches, your breathing becomes shallow. These are signs that your system is stuck in output mode, constantly spending energy without recovery. When you pause and become still, even briefly, you interrupt that pattern. Your body receives a signal that it's safe to reset. Muscles soften, breathing deepens. Your nervous system begins to shift from stress to regulation. This is not just relaxation, it is recalibration. And from that recalibrated state, your perception changes. What once felt overwhelming becomes manageable. What seemed urgent loses its intensity. You start to see timing more clearly, when to act and, just as importantly, when not to. This is where real efficiency begins. Not in doing more, but in doing what actually matters at the right moment, with a system that is fully aligned behind the action. The illusion loses strength here because it depends on constant movement to survive. It needs you distracted, reactive, and slightly off balance. The moment you become still and present, you step outside of its influence, and yet there's a resistance that often appears right at this point. A quiet voice that says, "If I stop, everything will fall apart." But if you look closely, you'll notice something different. Much of what you feared losing was never stable to begin with. It was being held together by effort, not by alignment. Stillness doesn't destroy what is real. It reveals what is. And that can feel unsettling because it challenges everything you were taught about productivity, effort, and control. It asks you to trust a process that is not driven by force, but by coherence. Which leads to a deeper question that begins to emerge naturally from this experience. If stillness holds so much energy, if stopping allows reality to reorganize itself, then why were you taught to fear it in the first place? And this is where everything society taught you shatters and the game changes. You were made to believe that staying still means weakness or giving up. Yet quantum physics shows us that the absolute vacuum is not empty, but the space with the highest energy density that exists. Deep stillness is not the absence of action. It is the most aggressive creative force in all of reality. This idea challenges something very deep in you. From a young age, you were trained to associate movement with value. Doing more meant being more. Producing more meant becoming more. And anything that looked like pause, rest, or stillness was quietly labeled as laziness, delay, or even failure. That conditioning didn't happen by accident. It built a powerful illusion, one that keeps you in constant motion, constantly proving, constantly trying. And as long as you remain in that cycle, you never fully access the deeper layer of your own energy. Because stillness requires trust, and trust is not something the illusion wants you to develop. When you stop, when you become truly still, not distracted, not scrolling, not filling the silence, you enter a different kind of space. At first, it can feel empty, almost uncomfortable. There's no immediate feedback, no sense of progress, no visible result. But that perception is misleading. What feels like emptiness is actually density. In quantum physics, what we call empty space is filled with fluctuations, possibilities, and latent energy. It is not inactive. It is simply not expressed yet. The same applies to your internal state. When you remove the noise, the reactions, and the constant doing, you don't become empty. You become full in a different way, full of potential. This is where inertia is misunderstood. You were taught that inertia is about staying stuck, about not moving, about being passive. But there's another side to it that is rarely discussed. Inertia is also stability. It is the ability to remain grounded, unmoved by external chaos, until a clear direction emerges. Without that stability, every external force pulls you in a different direction. You react to messages, to expectations, to pressures, to fears. Your path becomes fragmented because you're constantly adjusting to what is happening around you instead of anchoring into something deeper. The illusion tells you that responding quickly is strength, that adapting instantly is intelligence. But without internal stillness, what you call adaptation is often just reaction, and reaction consumes energy without building anything solid. Stillness changes that dynamic. When you allow yourself to remain in that grounded state, even when there's pressure to act, you begin to notice something subtle but powerful. Not every impulse deserves action. Not every opportunity deserves a response. Not every problem requires immediate intervention. This is where discernment is born. And discernment is what transforms energy into results. Instead of scattering your efforts, you begin to direct them. Instead of chasing movement, you begin to create impact. Your actions become fewer, but they carry weight because they come from a place that is stable, not reactive. This is why stillness can feel so uncomfortable at first. It removes the pravichka, habit, of constant engagement. It forces you to face the possibility that much of what you've been doing was not necessary. That realization can feel like loss, but it's actually a form of liberation, because once you see through the illusion, you can no longer be driven by it in the same way. You begin to question the urgency. You begin to notice when you're about to act out of pressure instead of clarity. And in that small space between impulse and action, something new becomes available. Choice. Real choice is not reactive. It doesn't come from fear or from the need to maintain control. It comes from awareness, from being able to observe what is happening without immediately being pulled into it. This is where your relationship with reality begins to shift. You're no longer just a participant being pushed around by circumstances. You start to become something else, something quieter but far more powerful, an observer. And this shift is not just philosophical. It has practical consequences. The way you see situations changes. The way you interpret events changes. Even the way outcomes unfold begins to feel different, as if something subtle is reorganizing around your presence. The illusion begins to lose its grip because it depends on unconscious participation. It needs you reacting, moving, doing without questioning. The moment you step back and simply observe, you interrupt that pattern. And that interruption opens the door to a completely different way of interacting with reality, one where your presence alone begins to influence what happens next. Instead of being the particle blindly colliding and hurting itself against life's obstacles, you must become the observing mind. Science shows that the mere attentive presence of an observer alters the subatomic behavior of matter. When you stop physically fighting chaos and simply observe it, you force the universe to rewrite probabilities in your favor. This is not about control in the way you were taught. It's not about forcing outcomes or manipulating situations until they match your expectations. It's about something quieter, but far more precise. The moment you shift from reacting to observing, you step out of the noise and into a position of influence. Most people never reach this point because they are too entangled in what is happening. They feel everything as urgent. Every problem demands a response. Every discomfort demands action. And in that constant movement, they lose the ability to see clearly. They become part of the turbulence they are trying to escape. The illusion keeps them there, convincing them that engagement equals effectiveness. But observation works differently. When you truly observe, you are not passive. You are attentive without interference. You allow reality to reveal itself without immediately trying to change it. And in doing that, something unexpected happens. Patterns begin to emerge. You start to see what repeats. You notice what triggers you. You recognize how certain situations unfold in predictable ways. And more importantly, you begin to see your own role in those patterns. This is where power begins, because once you can see a pattern clearly, you are no longer trapped inside it. Think about a moment when you reacted too quickly, said something, did something, and only later realized it wasn't aligned with what you actually wanted. In that moment, you were not observing. You were inside the reaction. Now imagine the same situation but with a small gap, just a few seconds where you notice the impulse before acting on it. That gap changes everything. It gives you space, and in that space a different response becomes available. This is the practical side of the observer effect in your life. It's not about controlling reality at a distance. It's about changing the way you participate in it. And when your participation changes, outcomes begin to shift, because your reactions are part of the system. When you react unconsciously, you reinforce the same cycles. When you observe consciously, you interrupt them. And that interruption creates new possibilities that were not available before. The illusion tries to pull you back by making observation feel slow or unproductive. It tells you that if you don't act immediately, you'll miss your chance. That if you don't respond now, you'll lose control. But look closely, How many times has immediate reaction actually improved the situation? And how many times has it made things more complicated? Observation doesn't remove action. It refines it. It allows you to act from clarity instead of impulse, from awareness instead of pressure. And that difference may seem small in the moment, but over time, it completely changes the trajectory of your life. There's also something deeper happening here. When you observe without resistance, you stop feeding the emotional charge of a situation. You stop amplifying it with fear, urgency, or frustration. And without that extra energy, many problems begin to lose their intensity on their own. It's like removing fuel from a fire. The situation may still exist, but it no longer controls you in the same way. You can see it, understand it, and respond to it without being consumed by it. This is where your presence becomes a stabilizing force. Instead of being pulled in different directions, you become centered. Instead of reacting to every external shift, you remain grounded, and that grounded state begins to influence what happens around you. People respond differently. Situations unfold with less resistance. Timing starts to feel more natural, less forced, not because you are controlling everything, but because you are no longer interfering with everything. The illusion loses its hold when you realize that not every situation needs your immediate involvement. Some things resolve themselves when you stop pushing. Others reveal their true nature when you simply give them space. And in that space, your role becomes clearer. You begin to sense when to step in and when to hold back, when to speak and when to remain silent, when to act and when to wait. This sensitivity cannot exist in a state of constant urgency. It requires stillness. It requires attention. It requires the willingness to observe without immediately needing to change what you see. And as you develop this, something subtle begins to happen inside you. The tension you once carried starts to loosen. The need to control every outcome begins to fade. You realize that your power was never in forcing reality, but in how you relate to it. But there is still one critical piece missing, because even if you learn to observe, even if you stop reacting automatically, there is a deeper habit that can quietly drain your energy if you're not aware of it, something that continues to leak your focus and weaken your presence without you even noticing. Remember that critical mistake of forcing things that I warned you about earlier? The only way to reverse it is through intentional stillness. By consciously pausing and focusing on the present moment, letting go of desperate control, you stop the energy leak and stabilize your field. Your natural magnetism begins to flow again, instantly dissolving that blockage. Most people don't realize they are leaking energy all day long. It doesn't feel like a leak. It feels like thinking, worrying, planning, replaying. It feels like staying on top of things. But every time your attention drifts into what you can't control or clings to what hasn't happened yet, a small part of your energy gets pulled away from the present. And when that happens repeatedly, your system weakens. Not in an obvious way, but in a subtle loss of presence. You become slightly disconnected from what is in front of you. Your actions lose sharpness. Your words carry less weight. Even your decisions begin to feel uncertain, as if something inside you is not fully behind them. This is the magnetic leak. Your energy is no longer contained. It's scattered across imagined futures, unresolved past moments, and constant internal noise. And when your energy is scattered, your ability to influence reality decreases. Because influence requires coherence. The illusion tells you that thinking more will solve the problem, that if you just analyze every angle, anticipate every outcome, and stay mentally engaged at all times, you'll gain control. But what actually happens is the opposite. You dilute your power. Imagine trying to light a fire with sunlight. If the light is spread across a wide area, nothing happens. But if you focus it through a lens into a single point, it becomes strong enough to ignite. Your attention works the same way. When it's scattered, it warms nothing. When it's focused, it transforms. Intentional stillness is what brings that focus back. It's not about emptying your mind or forcing yourself into silence. It's about noticing where your attention is going and gently bringing it back, again and again, not with frustration, but with awareness. Right now, if you pause for a second, you can feel it. Your body is here, your breath is happening. There is a simple, grounded reality available in this moment that requires no effort to maintain. But your mind often moves away from it, chasing scenarios that don't exist yet, or trying to rewrite things that already happened. Each time it does, a small amount of energy follows, and over time that creates a constant state of low-level depletion. When you return to the present, you begin to seal that leak. Your energy stops flowing outward into unnecessary directions. It starts to gather again. You feel more solid, more centered. Your thoughts become clearer, not because you're thinking more, but because there's less noise interfering. This is where your natural magnetism begins to reappear. It's not something you create. It's something that becomes visible when interference is removed. When your system is coherent, your presence changes. People feel it, even if they can't explain it. Situations respond differently. Opportunities seem to align more easily, not because you are forcing them, but because you are no longer disrupting the process. The illusion loses its grip here because it depends on fragmentation. It needs your attention divided, your energy leaking, your focus unstable. The moment you become fully present, that structure begins to collapse. And yet, there is a habit that tries to pull you back. The habit of checking, of needing reassurance, of looking for immediate results to confirm that what you're doing is working. This is another form of leakage, more subtle but just as powerful, because every time you seek confirmation too soon, you shift your attention away from the present and into expectation. And expectation, when driven by urgency, reopens the leak. You start to monitor instead of trust, to chase instead of allow, and the cycle begins again. Sealing the leak requires something simple but not easy. Consistency, not perfection, not total control over your thoughts. Just the willingness to notice when your attention drifts and bring it back without creating more tension. Over time, this builds a kind of internal stability that doesn't depend on external conditions. You don't need everything to go your way to feel centered. You don't need immediate answers to remain calm. You begin to carry your state with you instead of letting circumstances define it. And from that state, something interesting happens. The tension you once carried starts to dissolve. That constant pressure to act, to fix, to control begins to lose its intensity. Your body softens. Your breathing changes. The weight you didn't even realize you were holding starts to lift. It's not dramatic. It's quiet. But it's real. And as that tension begins to fall away, you start to see how much of your effort was coming from holding everything too tightly. How much of your energy was being used just to maintain that internal pressure, which naturally leads to the next shift, one that goes even deeper into the way you've been carrying yourself through life. That crushing weight in your chest, the feeling that everything depends on your urgency and effort. When you learn to become still, that armor of tension melts away. You realize the universe has its own currents, and there's no need to row until your muscles tear when you understand how to release the oars and move with the tide. For a long time, that tension felt necessary. It felt like protection, like responsibility, like the only thing holding your life together. You carried it in your body without even questioning it. Tight shoulders, shallow breath, a constant readiness, as if something could go wrong at any moment. And because you lived with it for so long, it started to feel normal. But normal doesn't mean natural. That tension is not your strength. It's your system trying to compensate for a lack of trust. Trust in timing, trust in process, trust in something beyond constant effort. The illusion convinced you that if you loosen your grip, everything will fall apart. So you hold tighter. You monitor everything. You anticipate problems before they happen. You prepare for outcomes that may never come. And all of this creates a kind of internal armor, rigid, heavy, always active. From the outside, it can look like discipline, like control. But from the inside, it feels like pressure that never fully turns off. The problem is that this armor doesn't just protect you from uncertainty, it also blocks flow. When your system is tense, your perception narrows. You focus on what could go wrong instead of what could align. You become less flexible, less open to unexpected solutions. Even when something good appears, you may hesitate or overanalyze it, because your baseline state is defense. You are not just holding tension. The tension is shaping how you experience reality. And this is where stillness begins to change everything. When you allow yourself to pause, not just physically but internally, you start to notice that the armor is not fixed. It's not who you are. It's something you've been maintaining. And what is maintained can be released. At first it happens in small ways. Your breath deepens without you forcing it. Your jaw relaxes. Your shoulders drop slightly. These are subtle shifts, but they signal something important. Your system is beginning to feel safe enough to let go. Not because everything is solved, but because you're no longer feeding the sense of urgency. The illusion loses power in this moment because it depends on that urgency to survive. It needs you to believe that everything is critical, that every second matters, that any pause is dangerous. But when you actually pause and nothing collapses, something inside you recalibrates. You start to question the tension itself. You begin to see that much of what you were holding was not required. It was habitual, a learned response to uncertainty, not an accurate reflection of reality. And as that realization deepens, the armor begins to crack. You don't need to force it off. In fact, trying to force relaxation is just another form of tension. Instead, it dissolves as you stop reinforcing it. As you stop feeding it with constant worry, constant control, constant mental pressure. What replaces it is not weakness, it's responsiveness. Without the armor, you become more sensitive to what is actually happening instead of what you fear might happen. You can adjust without overreacting. You can move without rushing. You can respond without carrying unnecessary weight. This is where life begins to feel different. Not because external conditions suddenly become perfect, but because you are no longer fighting them in the same way. You start to notice that there are rhythms, patterns, and openings that were always there, but you couldn't see them through the tension. It's like trying to navigate water while gripping the oars in panic. The tighter you hold, the less you feel the current. The more you exhaust yourself, the less progress you make. But when you ease that grip, even slightly, you begin to sense the movement beneath you. And that changes how you act. Instead of forcing direction, you start working with it. Instead of pushing constantly, you begin to choose your moments. Your actions become more precise, less frequent, and far more effective. The illusion tries to return here in a different form. It whispers that if you relax too much, you'll lose your edge, that without tension, you'll become passive or fall behind. But look closely. Was that tension really giving you an edge? Or was it draining your energy while creating the appearance of control? As the armor continues to dissolve, you begin to experience something unfamiliar but powerful, a sense of ease that does not reduce your effectiveness but refines it. And from that place, a new kind of action starts to emerge, not driven by pressure, not fueled by fear, but guided by clarity, timing, and a quiet certainty that doesn't need to prove itself through constant effort. This doesn't mean you stop acting in life. It means the quality of your movement changes. You begin to act only when the impulse arises from clear and calm intuition, not anxiety. A single action taken from this unshakable stillness holds 1,000 times more power and precision than years of blind effort. At first, this can feel unfamiliar. You're used to acting quickly, filling every gap with movement, responding the moment something appears. There's a rhythm you've been following for years, driven by urgency and reinforced by the illusion that speed equals effectiveness. But when you slow down internally, something interesting happens. The impulse to act doesn't disappear. It becomes clearer. Instead of 10 competing thoughts pulling you in different directions, you start to feel a single, clean signal. It doesn't shout. It doesn't rush you. It simply feels right, steady, grounded, and specific. This is where frictionless action begins. It's not about doing less for the sake of doing less. It's about removing everything that is unnecessary so that what remains can move without resistance. When your mind is not overloaded and your body is not tense, your actions don't have to fight against internal noise. They flow through a clear channel. Think about moments in your life when something just worked. You didn't overthink it. You didn't force it. You simply moved, spoke, or decided, and the result aligned naturally. There was no struggle, no second guessing, no need to correct yourself afterward. That wasn't luck. That was alignment without friction. The problem is that most of the time this natural state is buried under layers of urgency and doubt. You act before the signal becomes clear. You move while still questioning, and that creates interference. Part of you goes forward, another part holds back, and that internal split weakens the action. The illusion tells you that acting quickly will resolve the uncertainty, but in reality, acting from uncertainty often creates more of it. You end up adjusting, correcting, redoing, spending more energy than necessary because the original movement wasn't fully aligned. Frictionless action removes that cycle. It begins before the action itself. It starts in the pause, in the moment where you allow the noise to settle just enough to hear what is actually there. And when you move from that place, the action carries a different quality. It's precise. You say exactly what needs to be said, without adding or holding back. You take the step that matters, without scattering your energy across multiple directions. You recognize when to move, and just as importantly, when not to. This is where efficiency becomes almost effortless. Not because you're doing nothing, but because you're no longer wasting energy. Every movement has a purpose. Every decision has clarity behind it. And because of that, you don't need to compensate with extra effort. There's also a shift in how time feels. When you act from urgency, everything feels compressed. There's always something else waiting, something else demanding attention. You move quickly, but the sense of pressure never leaves. When you act from stillness, time opens up. You're not rushing from one thing to another. You're fully present in what you're doing, and that presence makes each action more complete. You don't carry unfinished energy into the next moment because you were actually there for the one you just lived. This reduces mental residue. You stop replaying conversations. You stop questioning decisions. You stop wondering if you should have done something differently. Not because you're perfect, but because you were aligned when you acted. And alignment leaves less room for regret. The illusion struggles to survive in this state because it depends on doubt and urgency. It needs you to feel like you're always behind, always needing to catch up, always one step away from losing control. But when your actions are precise, that feeling begins to fade. You're no longer chasing outcomes. You're participating in a process that unfolds with clarity, and that changes your relationship with results. You still care, but you don't cling. You still act, but you don't force. There's a quiet confidence that starts to build here. Not loud, not performative, just a steady sense that you can trust your timing, that you don't need to rush to prove anything, that when it's time to move, you will know, and when you move, it will matter. And over time, this creates a completely different pattern in your life. Instead of constant effort with inconsistent results, you begin to experience fewer actions with greater impact. Things that once required struggle start to unfold with less resistance. Not because life becomes easier, but because you are no longer creating unnecessary friction. And as this pattern stabilizes, something even more powerful begins to take shape. Your presence itself starts to carry weight. You don't need to push as hard. You don't need to chase as much. There's a subtle shift where things begin to come toward you, not because you're pulling them, but because of the state you're holding. A kind of center begins to form. Quiet, stable, and increasingly influential. While the external world runs aimlessly toward exhaustion, you become a different force of nature. You stop being the comet that burns itself out racing through space and become a massive celestial body instead. Your peace transforms into a gravitational center so powerful that solutions, money, and people begin to orbit you naturally. This shift is not visible at first. There's no dramatic moment where everything suddenly changes. From the outside, your life may even look quieter, slower, less reactive than before. But internally, something fundamental has reorganized. You are no longer moving randomly through life. You are holding a center. And that center changes how everything relates to you. When you were acting from urgency, you were like a comet, fast, bright, constantly in motion, but unstable. You had to keep moving to maintain momentum. The moment you slowed down, everything felt like it might collapse. That's the nature of that state. It depends on continuous effort. The illusion thrives there because it keeps you chasing, adjusting, reacting. But a gravitational center doesn't chase anything. It doesn't need to prove its power through speed. Its strength comes from mass, from stability, from consistency, from coherence. It holds its position, and because of that, other things begin to move in relation to it. This is what starts to happen when your internal state becomes stable, your decisions become clearer, and because of that, people trust them more. Your communication becomes more direct, and because of that, it carries more weight. You stop overextending your energy, and because of that, what you do offer becomes more valuable. Nothing is forced, but everything becomes more effective. You may notice that certain opportunities begin to appear without you chasing them. Conversations open up at the right time. Ideas come together with less effort. Even financial or professional movement can start to feel less like a struggle and more like a natural progression. This is not random. It's the result of coherence. When your energy is no longer scattered, it becomes consistent. And consistency creates a kind of signal that others can feel, even if they don't consciously understand it. You become someone who is not easily pulled into chaos, not easily distracted, not easily destabilized, and that is rare. In a world driven by urgency, stability stands out. The illusion tries to reinterpret this in a misleading way. It may tell you that you're doing less, that you should be more active, more aggressive, more visible. It may try to pull you back into old patterns of proving, chasing, and overextending. But if you pay attention, you'll notice something different. You are no longer driven by the need to fill every space. You're comfortable allowing things to come into alignment instead of forcing them into place. You're willing to wait when waiting is the right move. And when you act, it's not out of pressure, it's out of clarity. This is what gives your presence weight. People begin to respond to you differently, not because you're trying to influence them, but because you're not reacting in predictable ways anymore. You're not feeding the same patterns of urgency and tension. You're holding something steadier, and that steadiness becomes attractive, not in a superficial sense, but in a functional one. Others can rely on it. Situations can organize around it. It becomes a reference point in environments that are otherwise unstable. At the same time, your relationship with outcomes continues to evolve. You're no longer trying to control every detail. You're creating conditions instead. You focus on your state, your clarity, your timing, and from there you allow results to form. This doesn't mean everything always goes your way, but it does mean that when things don't align, you don't collapse with them. You remain centered. You adjust without losing your stability. And because of that, you recover faster, learn faster, and move forward without carrying unnecessary weight. The illusion weakens even further here because it depends on external validation. It needs you to measure your worth by immediate results, constant activity, visible progress. But when you become a gravitational center, your reference point shifts inward. You measure alignment, not just output. You value clarity over speed. You trust timing instead of forcing it. And over time, this creates a completely different trajectory. Instead of burning out and restarting again and again, you build something that sustains itself. A way of operating that doesn't depend on pressure, but on presence. And from that presence, your influence expands, not through force, but through consistency. You don't need to run after everything anymore, because what truly aligns with you begins to recognize where to find you. The illusion of constant action was a perfectly designed trap to keep you running, too exhausted to access who you truly are. Your greatest act of power was never to shout louder than the noise of the world, but to have the supreme courage to become silent. Take a deep breath, release control, and watch the entire universe reshape itself around your stillness. This is where everything changes, not outside but within you. When you stop chasing, you start seeing. When you stop forcing, you start aligning. And in that quiet space, you realize you were never lacking power. You were just too distracted to feel it. Now I want you to mark this moment. Write in the comments, "Stillness is my power." This simple act shows you made it here, and more importantly, that you're choosing a different way to move through life. If this resonated with you, watch one of the videos on your screen right now. And if you want to go deeper and support this channel, consider becoming a member. Exclusive content is coming soon.